Welcome to Cut to the Chase, where we talk about compelling legal, regulatory, and public interest information and news. Your host is Greg Goldfarb, an attorney, entrepreneur, investor, and activist.
All right, folks, it's time for our favorite podcast, Cut to the Chase. 435 years ago, one of the famous playwrights said, "Let's kill all the lawyers." And since then, a lot of society just does not like lawyers. They think we're chasing ambulances. They think we're keeping bad guys and gals out of prison. They think we're up to no good. But we are here today to help debunk that myth and show you some of the good stuff that lawyers have done. In particular, this gentleman here, Troy Rafferty. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on, Greg.
Troy's a partner, shareholder at Levin, Papantonio, Rafferty. I know you know that law firm, and they have done amazing work, okay? Not just amazing work for their individual clients, but I'm talking amazing work for society for years, decades, whether it's going after the tobacco industry, whether it's cleaning up water contamination, which is going on right now, in part due to them, whether it's helping out on correct all the opiate abuse that's gone on as well. These guys and gals at this law firm have done an enormous good for society. And now I'm going to tell you about another story that they just accomplished, which is dealing with the troubled teen industry. And I know some of you parents out there, you got your kids are driving you crazy, smoking, drinking, truancy and all that. And you're like listening to your friends telling you to send them to the wilderness or some retreat or what have you. And now all of a sudden you're looking at Netflix and you're seeing the program docuseries, and you're like, what did I do? Troy, let's talk about the Dozier School, what happened there, and what your law firm and you have accomplished.
Well, what happened at the Dozier School is really a symbol of what is happening all over the country. And it really is. So the Dozier School in Marianna, Florida, was open for 111 years, and it was a place where I hate to call it a school because it wasn't a school. It was literally. It was a slave labor camp, and that's what it was. And so what they would do is the law enforcement would pick up kids who were truants or smoking a cigarette or were otherwise incorrigible, as they would label them, and they would take them to the Dozier School, and they would make them stay there, and they would make them work in the fields 14 hours a day. And then at night, there was a place called the White House. And the White House was this small white building. I don't know if you can see this, but I got my White House boys bracelet on. But the White House was a small cinder block white building, and they used that. There was 2 rape rooms and 2 beating rooms. And because you couldn't beat and rape blacks in the same room as you did the whites, because it was completely segregated. And so what they would do is they would grab kids out of the beds at night, take them to the White House. And the reason they used the White House was because it was the loudest exhaust system. So they could turn on the exhaust and it would quiet the children's screams. And we're talking, I'm talking about kids that were as young as 5, 6, 7 years old. They would pull them out and they would take them in. They would beat them with this 20-inch paddle, and it had a leather strap attached to it with metal studs, so that when they hit the children, it would rip the flesh from their body. And I can tell you this, when I got contacted, Mike Papantonio got contacted, and then he got me, and then he contacted me, and he and I went out to the Dozier School, and I can tell you, the evil is still palpable in that school. And it closed. It opened in 1901. It didn't close until 2011, if you can believe that.
Wow. Goodness.
I mean, if you can believe that. And they would take the kids, beat them. So far, we've found 55 remains of children buried in unmarked graves, and basically in a pit is what they did.
Yeah.
They would take them out back and just bury them. When they did medical experiments on them, they did such horrific things. It was unbelievable. And you can I've gotten very close to the survivors. I don't want to call them victims, because these gentlemen are survivors. I mean, to go through what they went through, and to be able to tell their story. So basically, they were abused, beaten, raped, and then ultimately murdered. And for example, a bunch of gentlemen, after we got the bill passed, and I'll talk about the bill in just a second. But we all gathered outside the Senate, in the Senate rotunda, when we got the bill passed, and they asked me to close my eyes, and then I opened them after they said open them, and they all had a marble. They all carried a marble. They said that was one of their friends, and in the remains that they found, that was the only thing he had in his pocket.
Oh my God.
Was one single marble.
Oh my
And
God.
I said, and they were very kind and probably overly generous as to my work on it, but they gave me a marble. And they said, we want you to carry this marble with you. Sorry, I do get, and I'm going to apologize to you and your listeners a little bit, because I do get a tad bit emotional when I talk about this, because these folks are such fine people and so courageous. So talking about the bill a little bit, they went up to the Senate and the House 16 years in a row before they contacted Mike Papantonio and myself. And they went up there and they got no justice, none, zero. And so it was unbelievable to hear their stories. I mean, this is about them. It's not about me. It's not about my law firm or Pap or anybody else. This is about them. And Pap and I got together and said, we're going to take this on and we're going to do it for free. We don't want any money from anybody. And we want all the money to go to the survivors. And so we got the bill passed this year. So they contacted Pap and I 2 years ago, and we got it done because, and I'm going to give credit to a lot of the legislators. And I'm sorry, I'm going on, and so you can interrupt me anytime you want, Greg. But but I drafted a bill that was very simple, and a lot of courageous lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat. Representative Salzman, who's a Republican in the House, she carried the bill. Senator Roussan in the Senate. And we were able to get everybody together, and the Speaker of the House, the Chair of Judiciary, the Chair of Appropriations, who ultimately helped get this thing funded so that we can have a victims compensation fund for these survivors, and we can do something good. And that's what Pap and I sought out, was to just do something good for these people. Because when Pap and I went to the school, I'll tell you one quick story. And that is, I was talking to one of the survivors at the school, and we were at the school. And like I said, you could almost still hear the children's screams. It was that palpable. You could hear the children's screams. And he said, Troy, he said, let me tell you something. I did 3 tours in Vietnam. I've been shot several times in war. He said, I've crawled through the muck and the blood and everything in Vietnam, through the jungles. He said, I would rather be back there than be here at this school today. Because every night you lived in fear, not knowing if you were going to be the one that would be pulled out of bed and taken to the White House, and if you would ever return. And so the way they did it, the way they beat the children, they would make them get on a cot in the White House and get on all fours and hold the bed rail. That's what they would do. And if you were getting 50 licks, then if you let go of that bed rail at 48 or 49, it would start from 1.
Oh,
and
man.
they would go back at it. And then they would just dump them out the back door, bleeding, dying, having been raped. It was just but I think the bigger issue, so we did get the bill passed. We got the bill passed. It's on the governor's desk. I hope and pray that the governor signs it. And we're able to get, and it's really not about the money, Greg. It's about a sense of validation. Representative Salzman, who is just a champion, she gave a closing argument on the floor of the House of Representatives just maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago. And I was there, all the Dozier boys, we call them Dozier boys and White House boys. It just depends on who you're talking to, but it's all the same. And they were all there. They all came for the final passage at the House and the Senate. And she gave a speech that I thought was so incredibly moving. She told her own story of being raped and molested by her dad and her uncle, and how so she looked up at the sorry, I told you I get a little emotional.
Sorry, I wish I could give you a tissue,
but I'll be okay. But she looked up at the gallery and she asked everybody to stand up, all of the survivors, and they did. And she said, I want you to know, after she told this heart-wrenching story, I know and I see you, and we recognize you, and we hear you, and now we're going to put our money where our mouth is. And this is not, you started off your show about lawyers and being labeled, ambulance chasers or whatever else. I can tell you this has been a passion of mine for the last 2 years. And I have gotten calls from lawyers all over the state saying, hey, I've got these Dozier victims. I'd like to refer the case to you. I'm like, send them to me. Pap and I did a show that people can visit. We did a show saying, if you are a victim or, no, I'm sorry, I always say that, survivor of Dozier, you do not need to hire a lawyer. Call us. We will help you fill out the forms. We will submit it to the state to get you into the program. And you don't have to pay anybody anything. We will never take one fee or one cost. And so that is one message I do want to get across, because I think it's important. I think it's important for people to know that might be survivors, that you don't have to hire a lawyer. You just call our office and we'll help you.
All right, I got a bunch of questions. I'm going to throw 3 or 4 of them
Okay.
out.
Okay. All right.
All right. Well, first of all, I wanted to let people know Troy is like one of the best trial lawyers. You're not a lobbyist. You're not a legislator. You sort of went out of your, I wouldn't say your comfort zone, but this is not your forte. Just people hiring you and you going to Tallahassee and, convincing them to do what's right. Number one is, you say the governor still has to sign the bill.
Correct.
So my first question is, people that are listening that want him to sign the bill, should they call him up? email them. What should they do? Okay. When we're talking about the 55 people who were buried without tombstones, that's all you know of now. I mean, has there been like a full head count? How did the family members of these 55 people, were these deaths reported, or they just killed the people, buried them, and that was it? Let's go with those two questions first.
Okay. So first, yes, I think anybody that is a survivor or wants this bill passed, yes, I think reach out to the governor's office, reach out to Representative Salzman, Salzman, reach out to Senator Rousseau, who carried it in the Senate. Reach out to their offices and let them know. And they're my Florida House, my Florida Senate.coms are easily accessible and are able to be contacted. Second, most of the time with the murders, the parents weren't told anything other than they doctored up death certificates and said they died of pneumonia.
Yeah.
Or they died of this natural cause or that natural cause, none of which was true. And so they covered it up. There's been investigations done, thanks to the good work of a lot of the academia. They went out there and they helped find these. Now there's still 183 kids, and I don't like saying bodies because these are children.
Yeah.
There's still 183 children missing that were processed into that prison and never processed out. 183 are still unaccounted for.
Yeah.
And they're buried out on those grounds. I mean, I walked around those grounds. I went to the site where the 55 were found and buried. And so it's interesting that, we all just sit around and this is going on all over the country. Yeah. These schools. I mean, for example, we had Paris Hilton out in Las Vegas to tell her story, because there are racial divides, and I'll get to those in just a minute if you want to hear about it. Sure. But I'll let you ask the questions. It's your show. I know I tend to talk probably too much, but Paris Hilton, of all people, Paris Hilton went through 4 different reform schools where she was abused, where she was forced to shower in front of the guards, where she was abused. I mean, it's just, this is happening throughout the country in these types of schools, as they like to call themselves. And so it's interesting that nobody knows about it, that it's kind of and that's why I appreciate you having me on the show, because we have to keep this narrative out in the open. We have to let people know that this is still going on. It's going on right now while you and I are talking. While you and I are on this podcast, it's happening throughout the country in these different schools where these children are being abused, beaten, raped, humiliated, everything.
So, for those parents out there that are listening and like, well, my child really isn't going to a prison or a school. I took a look at an article that was written by Levin Pap's writer, I guess. You guys put out a magazine, and I want to make sure I got some of the names of these institutions or the types of institutions. So you parents out there that just sent your kid off and, my kid is out of my hair, I don't have to worry about it. We're talking about places that are referred to as the wilderness, which I know somebody that actually went out to the wilderness, and, I kind of encouraged that person's parent to send him out there because she couldn't take care of him. He was too much for her to handle. You've got faith-based conversion camps. You got juvenile psychiatric homes. You got therapeutic boarding schools, residential facilities, And that isn't even the whole list of it. So if you got a kid out there at one of these type of, you better pay attention to what's going on. And, one of the things that I heard the Paris Hilton, I was there for Paris Hilton in Vegas. And, before, I got to be honest, before I went, I'm like, I really don't want to hear about from Paris Hilton, but I did. And I could not believe her story. And then I heard this year, after the legislative success, you brought 3 of the survivors on and they spoke. I'd like you to tell me again what their names are. Extremely powerful presentation you put on in Vegas again. It was just a great presentation. How many survivors are still alive?
So there's probably, it's hard to estimate. We've done as much work as we can to try and estimate. I'm thinking there's probably 200 to 400 survivors still out there. I've gotten contacted by a lot of the survivors that obviously, because it was in the news and it's all over social media. But I would say 200 to 400, different, 200 to 400 survivors. And I think it really, because that was one of the reasons they contacted Papin and me, was because they're dying. A lot of these guys are dying. A lot of them have died. There's one guy, I call him Singing Cecil, because whenever he would get kind of nervous, he was this, I want to say 80-year-old black gentleman, and he was a survivor. He was in the White House. He's one of the White House boys. And we were walking into the Senate and through the security line. And all of a sudden I heard him start singing Under the Boardwalk. Under the boardwalk, and he has an incredible voice, by the way. But I could tell. And so when I saw him, when I got through security and I waited for him, I said, "It's okay, Cecil. You got this. You got this." Because it's hard. I thought it was really courageous of a lot of the legislators. In one committee, I testified in front of one of the Senate committees. I thought it was really poignant. And I never thought, and I'll be honest with you, I never thought of it this way. He said, "Troy, this is on the record. This is in the committee." He said, "Troy," he said, "I always tell, when I was a prosecutor, I tell rape victims that they only have to talk about this 3 times: deposition, a hearing, and trial. And then you never have to talk about it again. You never have to relive the pain of what you went through." And he said, and here we are. He was very good and very courageous. He said, "I'm embarrassed as to what we have made these gentlemen do. Come here 16 years in a row to relive the horrors of what they went through."
Yeah.
And he was very effective. He was very on point. But I never really thought about it that way. I just knew because I spent so much time with all of the survivors, that I just, you get to know them and you hear the stories, and and you kind of get engulfed in the stories and not the fact that they have to go talk about it, because that's even more painful sometimes, to have to continue reliving it and continue. And they did, and they have for years, they have for decades, they've relived that pain. A lot of them ended up in with PTSD,
Of course.
and a lot of them ended up going on. So here's one interesting thing I'll say. One of the interesting things, I think, is many of them ended up going into the military and fighting for our country, a country that essentially turned their back on them. And when they were children and in the most need and the most vulnerable state, turned their back on them.
Yeah.
And yet they went over there and they fought for their country. And that's really, that says something about the courage and the character of these survivors. And so it's unbelievable that they would go over there and do that after suffering at the hands of the state. This was the state of Florida. The state of Florida ran this school. These are all state employees. And the reality is, Dozier was one of the largest employers in this community. It was the largest employer in this community. So everybody in the community knew what was going on. And everybody ignored it because they were such a big employer.
Yeah.
And it's like what we talk about a lot of times, Gray. Follow the money. Follow the money, because that's where you'll find the evil.
Yeah.
If greed and money and profits always soak up everything.
So this is a story that has been going on for a long time. I mean, we can talk about the fact that this school, Dozier School, opened up in 1900, and there's all these other institutions, if you want to call them that. I'm sure, and you would see like the Charles Dickens, and just so much evil. I'm sure this has been going on from day one. So my two questions is how can this happen? I mean, are these institutions publicly funded? Are they regulated? Is there any oversight, or is this just like, hey, take our kids, fix them up, and hopefully you'll send them back to us alive?
Yeah, it's a combination of both. There are public funded ones and there are private funded ones. And, but no, there's very little investigation. There's very little oversight. There's very little of anything. And, one of the things that I was asked in one of the interviews that I did was, do you think people knew that this was going on? There's no way in any community you cannot know, because, like, for example, with Dozier, one of the people that was doing an interview of me, who is she's wonderful, Sue Strawn, but she said during the interview, she said, that was one of the big threats when you were a kid. If you don't shape up, we're going to send you to Dozier. And because everybody knew what was going on at Dozier. And that's one of the threats that people have. That's what happened to Paris. Like you said, you were there for Paris's speech, and that's basically her parents decided, well, you're a troubled kid, I'm going to send you off to this school, and not doing any follow-up, not doing any visitations, not doing any investigations, not looking at everything. Because if you look at all these schools, and I hate using that word, but if you look at all these institutions and you look at their marketing materials, you'll see it's all like a beautiful, picturesque place.
Yeah.
Oh, with serenity and happiness and ponds and all that kind of stuff. And then you get there and you realize none of that's true. None of it's true. And it's a prison. That's what it is. And you have guards making you, like Paris Hilton said, making you shower naked in front of all of these men, male guards and everything. And so, or in the case of Dozier, for example, beating them, raping them, making them live in fear, and shake in their beds that they can't sleep because they don't know if they're going to live or die that night. I mean, that's so there is so little regulation, so little oversight. It is unbelievable. And it takes place everywhere. It's like, it's kind of like human trafficking. Okay. People don't want to see or believe the ugliness that goes on, for example. And so they shut it out. They just like, oh, well, I mean, because, for example, human trafficking is going on right now. I mean, there are children chained to beds right now in different hotel rooms. There are people being exploited. There are young children being exploited right now. There are these institutions that parents send their children to, and where they're being abused. But the children are told specifically, if you say anything, you will never see your family again.
Yeah.
That's what they're told. And so they live in a state of fear and horror. But people don't want to believe that exists. you know, it's just one of those things where I think as long as you're disconnected from it and you don't have to actually see it, then you want to ignore it and live in your own little bubble and of happiness.
Yeah.
And that's the uh that's the thing. And we had several years ago at Mass Torts Made Perfect. I don't know if you were there. We had Elie Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor, just a tremendous, tremendous person, survivor. And I remember asking him, "Do you think the Holocaust could happen again?" And he specifically said, "Yes, I think it can and it will and it is." If you look at a lot of the atrocities going on in different third world countries and everywhere else. And I was kind of surprised because I don't know why I was surprised. I don't know why, but I was like, well, now everybody's got one of these, you know. So it's not. I'm like the publicity of it all would do away with these atrocities, and the fact of the matter is, it doesn't. It
Yeah.
doesn't. Everybody just ignores it because if you're not the one suffering, if you're not tied to someone who's suffering at the hands of these things, and then you stick your head in the sand. And we have to stop doing that as a society. We have to stop that. We have to do things. And listen, this is a little, this is I don't want to say a little thing, but this is a microcosm. What we did at the Dozier and getting the legislation passed in the Dozier bill. And but we have to change as a society. We have to get rid of our heads being stuck in the sand, only being concerned with ourselves, not trying to help other people without any profit, without any financial benefit. We have to change that narrative. And there's too much anger, hatred, divisiveness, and everything in the world.
All right. So I'm going to have a follow-up episode with your associate, Caleb Cunningham, about the current situation because Dozier is closed. They've been closed for over a decade, suing them for the harms that they've caused. It's too late. Statute of limitations. I mean, to me, everything you're sounding sounds blatantly criminal. Was there any criminal justice? Nothing. So, and you have a
Nothing.
situation that's going on right now. I did a little research preparing today to talk to you about this, and it looks like it's not like the federal government is completely ignorant of this. In 2008, the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, issued a report specifically about this. Back then, the Attorney General, John Ashcroft, was asked to look into it. He basically gave it the thumbs down. So now it's not regulated. The government doesn't really, I mean, aside from what you've been able to accomplish, hopefully in Florida, doesn't seem to be taking it serious. So again, we're back stuck with, all right, the government isn't helping us out. The industry doesn't give a rip. They're just going after profits. And so again, we're stuck with lawyers like you to go after these people. And we're going to talk about that in a different episode. I do want to focus a little bit about the legislation, the survivors and all of that. I would imagine that there are some survivors out there in Florida from this institution that are not aware of what's going on about this legislation. Do you agree with me, or do you think they all are locked in and know about this program?
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. No, no, I think we're doing our best to get the word out. We're doing publications, we're doing news media, we're doing social media, we're doing everything we can to get the word out. And I think it is getting out because I've gotten calls from hundreds of survivors. And so I think people are understanding that it's out there in terms of the Florida issue, and in terms of the Dozier School and what we did in the legislature. And so I think word's getting out there. And so I'm confident we will get all of the different survivors that are still alive. We'll get them into the program.
All right. And so, like you said, we're talking about filling out a form and submitting it at some point, assuming the governor signs the bill. Will there be like
Correct.
will there be a time frame for them to sign it? Like if they don't get it signed and filled out properly by a certain date, it's too late, or how is it written out?
It's written so they have until December 31st right now under the current legislation. And so we've got plenty of time. I've been telling everybody out there, here's what you can do between now and December 31st. And that is get proof together that you actually attended Dozier. Okay. One of the sad parts of this whole story too, Greg, is the fact that the state destroyed a lot of records.
Yeah.
They destroyed a lot of records. So the way we wrote the bill was you have to just show reasonable proof that you were there and that and an affidavit saying that you suffered abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, anything. And then you're in. And the state will have to, make good.
And for those that have fear about doing this, maybe, maybe you don't have enough education and skills to fill out a form. What's an affidavit? Your law firm is going to help out, no charge. You haven't gotten a penny from this. Your law firm you're not going to get a percentage of whatever they recover, nothing, zero, completely free. And you all will help them. And if anybody's out there that is hearing this and knows how to get in touch with me, but not your law firm, you can contact me and I will direct you to Troy and his outfit. So I want to end on this. The survivors that spoke, can you tell me they're at Mass Tort Made Perfect this last time? The three gentlemen that spoke. Can you tell me their names?
Yeah, so it was I always call him the captain. The captain, there was Charlie Fudge and there was Mr. Huntley. And they all suffered at the hands of the state. And we're at the school and they're just wonderful people. Cecil couldn't make it out. There's tons of them that came to the final passage of the bills that were very were very engaged. They kept coming up, they kept coming up, they kept coming up, and put themselves out there. And one of the things that I also want to point out is we also passed a companion bill which basically exempts any personal information. So you mentioned if somebody's scared to do it or doesn't want to do it because they don't want their name out there. The companion bill that we drafted and filed and passed is that it is all of the information that they put in is exempt from the public records law. So nobody can find out, if Mr. Huntley fills out a form and does it, that will never be able to be disclosed under a public records request.
Yeah.
And I thought that was important so that exactly what you just said, because that was a concern, was that it's safe, it's not disclosable, because a lot of these gentlemen never even, like one gentleman told me, he never even told his mother what happened. He only in the last 5 years even told his children or his wife what happened and how he was raped and beaten. And, so I wanted people to feel like it was safe. It's tough for somebody to get up and say, yes, I was raped or molested. I was beaten. I watched my friend die and be buried in an unmarked grave.
Right.
That's tough stuff. And so I do want to make sure that everybody knows that is the public records request would never be an issue. They cannot do it. We filed a completely separate bill saying that anybody that makes application to this fund, this victims compensation fund, will never have their information disclosed publicly.
Nice, nice. Well, listen, I hope to God that this legislation goes through. I know this is compensation. It's a $20 million package. Amazing work. I want to end the show with these two things for parents to hear me loud and clear. First of all, if your child is at one of these institutions, a retreat, some reform school, and your child is telling you they're getting abused, and you look at your wife or your husband and you say, listen, Johnny never told us the truth. Why should we believe him? It doesn't make sense. We're sending him to the school retreat. You better double check and make sure maybe your child is telling you the truth. That's number one. And number two, for you parents out there whose children, maybe you have a child says, hey, I want to go to law school. And your child is a good-natured child, says, I want to help out society. And you look at your spouse and you say, I don't think lawyers really can help out society at all. I'm going to steer my child away from that. Change your mind. This man over here, Troy Rafferty, and his law firm are a testament to how much help lawyers and law firms are doing for society. So I'm going to leave it on that. Troy, thank you for coming on my program. One of the exciting things about today and doing this is I get to go to my to-do list and scratch your name out, which has been on there way too long.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me on, and I appreciate all the work you do. I appreciate you keeping this narrative going, because it's important that we keep the narrative going and that we let people know that this is actually happening everywhere.
And listen, for you lawyers out there that are like, hey, I need to do something new. Maybe I want to jump on in. Maybe I've been practicing for 30 years, doing Social Security, wills and estates, but never really did anything good for society. There are two amazing conferences that take place every year that Troy's law firm puts on in Vegas, but they are by far the best, most informative, and also entertaining. I have to say, you guys put on quite a show. Mass Torts Made Perfect in fall, and we just had the last one a couple of weeks ago. It was amazing, and it's where I saw you talking with Cecil. So that'll do for this episode. Like I said, I'm going to have a follow-up one on the current state of affairs, and maybe your child is in one of these institutions or just came back and is telling you all these horrible stories. So Caleb, Troy's associate, will be talking about that one. All right. So Troy, go back to work. All right. You got to make it happen.
All right. Thanks. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
All right.
That's all for this episode of Cut to the Chase. But before you go, will you open up your podcast app and give us a 5-star review? You can also leave a comment about what you liked most or other topics you'd like us to cover. And please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming shows. Thanks, everybody. Be safe out there.